Hello, welcome to week 5 of Thinking Sociologically, and today we are going to talk about culture. We're going to talk about what culture is, what types of culture exist, and why we as sociologists and anthropologists like to study culture. So let's jump in. What is culture? When we talk about culture, what we're talking about is a shared set of beliefs, values, behavioral expectations, practices, language, dress, all of those things that make up a way of life for a group of people. Now, that's a very broad definition, and so there are alternative cultural constructions that we use to sort of break down this idea of culture and apply it in everyday social life. So, first, we'll talk about subculture versus counterculture. Subcultures and countercultures are thought about based on their distance to or away from the dominant social culture. So, subcultures share most things with the dominant culture, but they also have their own subset of values, beliefs, practices, behavioral expectations that go along with that. For example, I am from Minnesota and I am a lifelong Minnesota Vikings fan, and as such, that means I wear a lot of purple. Sometimes I wear Vikings horns. I know the Skull Viking song, and by extension, a little bit of Scandinavian. I don't know what the language is, but one of those sort of northern country languages. And so I belong to this particular subculture. But that subculture exists in this larger dominant culture of NFL fans, football fans, Midwestern football fans, and so on and so forth. Countercultures, by comparison, don't share much with the dominant culture. And in fact, in a lot of ways, they want to tear down the dominant culture and create something that they deem to be better and built in their own image. For example, the Ku Klux Klan is a culture, counterculture of people that's looking to restructure racial hierarchy in American society, which is the antithesis in a lot of ways of the dominant social culture. The sort of uprising of the QAnon group is another example of a growing counterculture in the US today. Um, let's talk about material versus symbolic culture. So, material is tangible culture, it's all of those sort of tangible products that we use to signal our membership in a particular culture. A good example of that is an Indian wedding, for example, where there is lots of symbolism in the dress, in the artistry, in the jewelry, in the music, in the ceremony, which are all tangible and signal this membership to a culture that is based on these broader beliefs, values, norms, behavioral expectations, and all of that. Symbolic culture, by extension, is not necessarily not tangible, but more representative. It's supposed to represent all of those values, beliefs, and behavioral expectations that people have. So, for example, here I have a person wearing a Star of David necklace, which symbolizes their membership in the Jewish faith. Okay, high culture versus popular culture is a little bit different because you're talking about access in this case. High culture is a set of cultural products that are um, created, or if not created, curated and displayed for the elite. So when you think about museums like the MoMA, like the Guggenheim, um, these are places that were created to to be in a space for elite people, people who understand the history and the background of the art they're being shown. And in order to know that, you have to be of a particular class. Now, this is changing as the world shrinks because the internet is around, and what is high culture versus popular culture is much more slim in margin now than it was even maybe 20 or 30 years ago. But by comparison, popular culture is about manufacturing something for mainstream accessibility. So if you think about an artist like Beyonce, she is manufactured in a lot of ways to be accessible to anybody. She has fans all over the world. Her art and her music are made available all over the world because the understanding is people want to see that. Okay, but I do want to be clear that these cultures overlap, with the exception of counterculture. All of these alternative cultural constructions overlap with one another. They are interconnected because there are values, beliefs, behavioral expectations that you can pull from some that apply to others. And so you may be a part of many different cultures at one time and either have some competing values, beliefs, and behavioral expectations, or a lot of places where those things line up quite nicely. Okay, now let's talk about why culture is important to study. We study culture in sociology and anthropology because it creates and provides social order for us as humans. It provides a map for living, for moving through daily life, for interacting with individuals that you meet along the way. It also allows you to develop shared understandings of the world, shared perspectives, and life worlds, we often call them in sociology, that we want. We want as humans to feel a part of the collective. And if it's doing all of this, then what it's also doing in a lot of ways is preventing the chaos that would happen if we as humans didn't have these guidelines by which to live. In a lot of ways, culture is human adaptation to environment. It is not simply that a people comes to live in a certain place and they create and perpetuate a culture that has nothing to do with the actual physical environment of that space. For example, again, I'm from Minnesota, and one of the sports that I can engage in with some measure of skill, though I don't often because I don't like it, is Nordic skiing, cross country skiing. The reason that I know how to cross country ski is because in middle school and high school in Minnesota, cross country skiing is a very normal and quite frequent activity because it can be cold and snowy in that state 6 or sometimes 7 months out of the year. It's hard to do sort of regular recess or gym outside in those cold, snowy conditions. And so instead, what we do is we Nordic ski. And so most schools have skis and poles and boots for every size student, and you engage in it all winter long as part of your exercise over the course of the day. That is a skill, a behavioral expectation, a practice that is a part of the culture of the state of Minnesota that has everything to do with the physical environment of the place. And if you were talking about California, I didn't go to high school and middle school in California, but I assume that they're not doing a lot of Nordic skiing during gym. And that's because where are they going to ski? There's no snow. Well, unless you go up into the mountains. Okay. Um, Cultures are major agents of socialization. When we talk about agents of socialization, we mean these sort of people that act as tools to socialize us. And that's because, as we talked about last week, um, the values and beliefs and behavioral expectations and practices that make up a culture are shared, they're learned, they're enforced. And if you are socialized well, they are eventually taken for granted because they are so ingrained in who you understand yourself to be and how you understand yourself to live. So, spend some time this week thinking about what cultures you belong to and how they have socialized you. You guys all did a little bit of this in the What Do I Know papers, but hopefully now that you have a few more concepts that you can apply directly to your analysis of your life, you can take that examination a little bit deeper than you did in that first paper. Okay, let's talk about norms versus laws because the way that we get people to buy in, the way that we can perpetuate that shared, learned, enforced, and taken for granted feeling of cultural membership are through norms and laws. That's how we govern one another. Norms are informal requirements, behavioral expectations for cultural membership, and laws are codified behavioral expectations rooted in cultural membership. So when we talk about norms, we can talk about norms a couple of ways. So there's folkways, which are very informal norms. Something that I am noticing as we get more acclimated to Zoom class is students saying goodbye and thank you at the end of the class as I close the meeting. And I've heard other faculty members talk about how nice that is as well. It's not required, it's not something that we've talked about, it's not something that's in the syllabus, but is increasingly becoming normative, and I would imagine more so as students hear their fellow students doing it. There's no punishment for not doing it. There's no requirement for buy-in, but the likelihood is that you will buy in because you are being socialized to do it over time. A more is a more formal norm. So, for example, you guys don't have to have your video cameras on during our Zoom discussions, but I do. Now, I don't have to, in that there is no policy written by the college that says that I have to. And again, it's not in the syllabus, there's no laws about it, and yet I do because it is sort of formally understood amongst faculty that we should at least allow the students to see us, even if we are not requiring them to let us see them all the time. And then lastly, there are taboos, right, which we think of as offensive to our understanding of membership in a particular culture. So again, we'll use the Zoom meetings as an example. If you were to come to a Zoom class with your camera on and no clothes on, that would be taboo because all the other participants would understand that as being offensive and inappropriate for this particular setting. And in which case, I'd probably just turn off your camera, which is it's good that I can do that. But so you can see the difference between folkways, mores, and taboos. And then there are sanctions. And sanctions are the way that we maintain these norms. So they are the punishments that come from not behaving accordingly. Um, there are informal sanctions, just revoking membership to a group or not speaking to someone or reprimanding them. And then there are formal punishments like prison time, fines, suspensions, detentions, those sorts of things that are written into policy with explicit, predetermined punishments that go with them. That's what we mean when we talk about codified. Laws are codified, but norms may not be. Norms are something that are ingrained into society, whereas codes are written by the institution themselves. Okay, when we talk about cultural difference, we're talking about social culture in a lot of ways and the diversity of type and access and audience, as we were talking about earlier in those alternative cultural constructions. Um, Cultural shock is when you enter a culture in which you are unfamiliar and have difficulty integrating yourself well because you don't know the behavioral expectations or the beliefs, the values, the language, the food. If you've ever traveled to a different country for the first time, you probably have experienced some form of cultural shock. Cultural leveling, by comparison, is the integration of Western um, values, beliefs, normative behavioral expectations, and practices um, in place of those facets of the culture that you are originally from. The last thing that I want to leave you with before we get to our active learning exercise is the idea that culture is determined by the ruling class. It is a reflection of those things that they like and enjoy. And as an example of that, I am using this chart that um, was used in the social media campaign in 2015, hashtag Oscars So White, that wanted to show the overwhelming whiteness of Academy Award winners for the last 15 years in all of the major categories. Some people have asked and continue to ask, why is something like this important? Well, when you talk about culture, high culture versus pop culture in this case, um, by perpetuating the race of the winners, you are also socializing all of the audiences who not only watch the movies but watch the award shows themselves to believe that the best actors and actresses, directors, screenwriters, and producers are white people. And then that becomes the expectation as opposed to just, a statistical coincidence. And we start to think of good pop culture in this case, or good movies, as having white people in them, being created by white people, and depicting white people's lives. And that is a way that culture becomes a reflection of the ruling class, which in this case, especially if you're talking about the movie industry, are white people. Okay, for your active learning exercise this week, we're going to do something a little bit different. I want you to find a cultural artifact from a culture that you are a member of. And this can even be just a photo that you find on the internet of the cultural artifact if you can't find a physical one. And bring it to our Zoom discussion this week. We're going to talk about what it represents, why it's important to the culture, and how that culture has socialized you. I'll see you then.